I'm going to move on to Ian Urbina now. And Ian is place, and now I found him. He's an investigative reporter who I first saw on MSNBC quite recently, based in Washington. His most recent series, The Outlaw Ocean, chronicles the diversity of crimes offshore, including the killing of stowaways, sea slavery, international dumping, illegal fishing, the stealing of ships, gun running, stranding of crews, and murder with impunity. He's reported from Africa, Asia, Europe, South America, and the Middle East. Much of that time spent on fishing ships. Mr. Urbina has also written extensively on criminal justice issues, including stories about the use of prisoners for pharmaceutical experiments, immigrant detainees working unpaid, solitary confinement in immigration detention facilities, and the dependence of the U.S. Defense Department on prison labor. I'll leave the rest of his bio for discovery later. I'm sure we can make it available. Ian, I'm going to start with one of the same questions and then a directed question at you. Can you please discuss the specific challenges you faced while researching transnational crime, investigating human rights abuses, providing assistance to refugees and migrants? And for you, in developing your article, The Secret of Prisons That Keep Migrants Out of Europe, is there a specific story or movement that sticks out to you?
Yeah, so just some context. So as you mentioned, the reporting I do is now based at a nonprofit called the Outlaw Ocean Project, which is a sort of ProPublica style news organization. The reason I'm on this panel is because of a story 2 weeks ago published in the New Yorker that looked at the migration challenge in Libya and detention facilities. To your specific question, I would say, you know, I took a team to Libya to report on this story. This was the second stint on this overall topic. I had done a piece previously for The Atlantic about the Italian government's leasing of 7 large cruise ships to house 10,000 migrants offshore, ostensibly to quarantine them, but also additionally to vet them and decide what to do with them and to keep them away from reporters and advocates and the like. In reporting on that story and getting on those vessels, the harrowing tales that everyone here already knows about what was happening in Libya sort of decided for me what the next investigation should be. So in May, I took a team of 4 of us to Libya to take a look specifically at one facility, Al Mabani, which means the buildings, which is the newest and largest and most notorious of the official detention facilities, and a specific murder that occurred in that facility, to some degree meant to be synecdoche of a larger tale of the kind of quintessential climate migrant and how they sometimes end up in these facilities. The other question, Dr. Lawrence, that you raised, I might jump to because it's more interesting, but to answer your first question, we were taken captive by a militia and disappeared into a prison and held for quite some time and pretty severely abused. So clearly of moments that I remember acutely, that part of our reporting effort will stick with me forever. Truth be told, I don't like to discuss it a lot because what happened to us and my team pales in comparison to what's happening routinely to hundreds and thousands of migrants in Libya who are disappeared and treated far worse than we were, and many of them don't make it out. So certainly our captivity was the moment in our reporting that stuck with me most.
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to stick with you and just also mention quickly that my longtime friend, Anthony Shadid, was also taken prisoner in Libya and had a very similar position towards his imprisonment as you. It spoke, you know what I'm saying, in a sort of similar way about not wanting to talk about it, but it also being harrowing. I also should have mentioned that you have a Pulitzer and a Polk, and hopefully our audience viewing you today can say, I knew you before you got the next award for this tremendous feat of reporting that you did in the New Yorker. And I'm hoping, if it hasn't already been done, that Natasha or Fatima can put a link to the article in the chat. The second directed question for you, Ian, because you have to leave early, and I'll ask Ahmed to bear with me while I help him because he has to leave early. How can Europe be incentivized to shift their involvement in the migrant and refugee crisis to actually protect migrants and refugees?
It's a really good question. And let me just say a couple things. One, Anthony Shadid was an editor of mine before I joined the New York Times 20 years ago. I worked on the Middle East, and Anthony Shadid was on the board of the directors at the think tank where I was based. He's an amazing journalist. He was an amazing journalist, much as you know, Bill. I also just want to say a quick thanks to Mark and Tom, who were amazing guides and tutors in the reporting, sort of helping me make sure I get it right when I reported this piece for the New Yorker. I want to sort of publicly thank them for all that. With regard to your question, I think there are multiple layers, and they might feel like a hodgepodge list. My outlook here on things that could change are differing in altitude. One is, I do think that the rhetoric that presently exists and fogs the space a bit, obscures the reality, needs to be confronted. So things like the reference to what's happening on the Mediterranean and the EU role, and referring to those as rescues as opposed to arrests, is a fundamental problem in the overall public understanding. These are arrests. Most of these are occurring in international waters. They're occurring against the will of migrants. They are picking up people and taking them back to a place that has been officially designated not a port of safety. These are not rescues. And so I think we all as a public need to really think clearly and soberly about that. I think furthermore, there is a sleight of hand, a rhetorical sleight of hand that I think certain folks in the EU have used for far too long in referencing the EU role on the Mediterranean and with regard to the abuses in the migration centers, which is to say, we in the EU, don't build, we don't arm, we don't uniform those guards at the detention centers. That's not our deal. Look to the Libyan government, it's their fault. And really what's happening there is terrible, but we can't do anything about it. I think that's really disingenuous. And I think more aggressive confronting of that rhetoric and saying, yes, but the raison d'etre of the migration centers is the very return policy that you've enabled through the Libyan Coast Guard. Those wouldn't exist. Surely they existed under Gaddafi, and they were not pleasant places then. There's always been those, but the filling of them is an EU creation, and the EU is very involved with everything around them, from the tablets to counting the migrants to the buses that carry them to the detention centers, and in so many other ways that we found. So I think that's the other thing. But there's a laundry list of other key ways in which EU policy could change, and some of them are already in motion. Litigation against Frontex. Frontex puts the drones and planes over the Mediterranean, providing the coordinates to member states, Italy, Malta, that then often gets handed off the Libyan Coast Guard. Libyan Coast Guard then goes and picks them up. If there wasn't that intel, the return policy would not be half as deadly and effective. And that's a EU creation. The weaponization of port administration, Doctors Without Borders and other ships that are actually doing true humanitarian rescues have a very harrowing time trying to do their work because of the way that ports on the European side handle them when they come back to shore. And that's a decided policy, and that could easily change. So these are just a couple of the examples. I mean, the IMO, for example, approved the change in status of Libyan search and rescue zone and expanded its realm, which has given cover to the Libyan Coast Guard to say, back off, even though we're in international waters, back off, Doctors Without Borders. These are, we have jurisdiction here. And if you get in our way, bad things will happen. We'll open fire. We're very aggressive moves. They're outside of their national waters, and they're invoking jurisdiction that has been sort of handed to them by the UN, by the International Maritime Organization, that should have never been handed to them. So these are all ways in which, if key players in Europe wanted to try to disrupt the current really abusive and efficient system of return to Libyan detention centers, these are just some of them that could be employed. And to your question before about statistics, 2015 saw 500,000 refugees and migrants cross the Mediterranean. So these numbers have been quite large in recent years, much larger than they are now in terms of overall flow.
Thank you, because I thought that was the case, but I said it's 2016, so thank you for being specific on that. I'm sure most of our panelists could have answered that question, but let me give you one more, Ian. Sorry, it was something I wanted to say. Oh, I just said, calling the Libyan Coast Guard a Coast Guard, and I've been doing a recent project with the US Coast Guard. It's just not the right term. I think if we had a term that meant militia and Coast Guard, and the negative definition militia, using for some of the militias in my introductory remarks, then we have a word closer to what the Libyan Coast Guard is. The last question to Ian, and I hope, Ian, you can stay as long as you can to listen to Ahmed. US and the international community do to protect these vulnerable populations and hold those facilitating the cycle of violence accountable?
Look, I often say reporters don't know anything. They just know people that know things. And two of them are on this call, Mark and Tom. And so I turn to my tutors in moments like this and say, what do you think? What is the appropriate answer here? Smart people I talk to on this tough question, and it is a tough question, say two things that I regurgitate. One is a bit more ambitious and big picture, and the other is a bit more applied and perhaps real world. My sense is the real world, one real world more immediate way to potentially reduce harm in these detention facilities might be to squeeze, for the EU, to squeeze pressure on the Libyan Coast Guard and that revenue stream as a method to get the Libyan government to pay attention to the serious concerns about what's happening on land to these migrants when they're returned. I'm not sure, again, as counseled by sources, that the EU has as much leverage over the militias and the federal authorities, DCIM, that run the detention centers. Tom and others are working hard to do harm reduction in those facilities. But in terms of really cleaning them up and getting more eyes in there, I think the pressure that could be applied probably goes through the Libyan Coast Guard. So that's one thing I've heard that sounds convincing. The other thing is a bit more meta and may sound quixotic or idealistic and implausible, but I do think if you're looking at a global stampede like climate migration, and you're looking at 150 million people over the next 50 years having to relocate, and you're looking at how this problem is going to increase, and you're thinking that your solution, whether it's the US government on the Mexican border, funneling money there to sort of southernize our border and stop migrants from reaching the US border, or the EU via Italy in Libya, outsourcing your policing of migration to failed states is a terrible idea. And dedicating so much of your funding towards symptoms rather than causes, more guys with guns, more SUVs in the deserts, more patrol vessels, rather than trying to look more at the push factors in Guinea-Bissau, like our main character, that are causing a lot of these folks to head to Libya. Again, that sounds pie in the sky and easy for me to say, but I do think we probably have to think at that altitude if we're going to really try to get to root causes of so many people traveling.
Well, I'd like to thank the rest of the panel for watching me because of Ian's schedule with giving him some extra time here, and for being excellent teachers. And I'd like to congratulate Ian for being an excellent student and an excellent communicator of the horrific context and conditions that so many thousands of victims are going through.